So today I'm going to talk specifically about tools to assess food systems, and I'm really going to focus on the food supply chain. All right, so this framework should be familiar to all of you. So it's the high-level panel of experts report on nutrition and food systems, conceptual framework on food systems. And so this has, I think, been guiding the course so far. So just to reorient you all to it, you have the drivers of the food system on the top. We're not going to go into detail on these in terms of the methods today, with the exception of maybe talking a little bit about them in the context of political economy analysis. And then we're going to talk mostly about food supply chain. So all these drivers feed into the food supply chain, which then influences the food environment, which is the place within the food system where consumers interact with to make decisions about which foods to acquire, purchase, and consume. And then how consumers interact with that food environment influences their behaviors and their diet and other health outcomes. So like I said, today I'm going to really focus on food supply chains. All right, so to guide us through the next this class and the next class, I thought it might be useful to use this framework that was developed by Corinna Hawkes. So this was based on the Innocenti framework for child-centered food systems. And so this framework, I think I shared it in the lecture that I gave a few weeks ago now. And the idea of this conceptual framework that's based on the Innocenti framework is to kind of walk you through the steps that you need to take to develop food systems interventions aimed at addressing different nutrition problems within a given population. So this paper was really based on children, but I've just adapted it a bit on the right-hand side here so that it's relatable to all populations. So there are 6 steps in this framework, and I'll go through each of these. And then over the course of this lecture and the next lecture, we'll be covering methods and tools to address all of these different steps. So the first is, what is the prevalence of underweight, stunting, overweight, obesity, and micronutrient deficiencies in the target population? The second is, which foods should food systems make more available, affordable, appealing, and aspirational to address these relevant forms? So whatever the nutrition problems identified in step 1 were. Step 3 is, why is the target population eating or not eating these foods, and how does this relate to the food environments they are in? Step 4 is taking account of the context in which people are living, which aspects of food environments should be changed to make these foods more or less available, affordable, appealing, and aspirational in the short and long term. The 5th is, what are the incentives and disincentives that are needed in the food supply chain, and where to create healthier food environments for the target population. And lastly, the 6th step is, what is the package of mutually complementary actions that can be adopted to address these nutrition problems in the context of all of these steps. And so the idea is really for these different steps to allow you to take more of a food systems approach to identifying interventions. So in terms of the next 2 lectures, like I said, today's is really going to focus more on food supply chain. So the 5th step of this framework, and then I'll talk a little bit about political economy analysis that would be addressing the 6th step, which is the package of mutually complementary actions. And then in your lecture on December 24th, that's group-based modeling, you'll also be addressing in some part this 6th step as well. Because the idea of this framework is really to acknowledge that it's not just one intervention that we would be adopting to try and improve nutrition outcomes when we're thinking about it from a food systems approach. It really would involve complementary actions, probably across the food system. And that's why it's important to have a good sense of the different methods and tools that you can use to measure the food supply chain, but also food environments, as well as diets and nutrition status. So like I said, I'll start by focusing on methods for assessing food supply chains. This is from the paper that was led by Corinna Hawks that I mentioned that has the conceptual framework that we're using to guide this lecture and next. And this is just an overview of the different methods for conducting food supply chain analysis. And if you have any questions during the lecture, just feel free to put them in the chat. I'll try and be mindful of taking a look at it. But if I don't see it, just also feel free to unmute yourself and ask away. All right, so in terms of the methods for conducting food supply chain analysis, there's various different methods that you can use. The first is value chain analysis, and really the goals of this approach is to identify entry and exit points throughout food supply chains to create value addition. And I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by value addition. Value chain analysis can include nutrition-oriented value chain analysis, strategic management value chain, and global value chain approaches. So really the background of value chain analysis is that it's a business it's a business approach to looking at how you can optimize value chains or supply chains. So it really came from the business literature. There's a professor at Harvard Business School called Michael Porter, and he's the one that actually began doing value chain analysis in the business sector. You can use various different methods as part of the value chain analysis. This includes things like on-farm surveys or assessments. You could do semi-structured interviews, document analysis, market surveys, consumer surveys, and household surveys. And I'll talk a little bit about these. Another approach, which I think is really useful and there's a very good guide on how to implement this, is the supply chain analysis for nutrition scan, or SCAN. And this was developed by Gain a few years ago now. The goals of this approach are to understand how the steps in the supply chain contribute to food accessibility, desirability, and quality, and to identify weaknesses or bottlenecks in supply chains and suggest potential points for intervention to improve nutrition. And the SCAN report has, like I said, the step-by-step approach on how to do this, and it includes various different methods, including doing intake surveys and consultation interviews, doing stakeholder analysis, price markup maps, doing SWOT analysis. So what are the strengths, weaknesses, opportunity, and threats to the supply chain? And this is, again, something that comes out of the business literature rather than nutrition literature. It also includes a supply chain heat mapping, and then a challenges and opportunity matrix, and then a traffic light model where you have the different policy options or interventions across the supply chain. And then you're looking at different criteria and evaluating them based on whether or not they seem like they would be feasible, and other criteria that are identified through the stakeholder work. And so like if it seemed like if the intervention was feasible, then it would get a green light versus red light if it wasn't, as an example. Another approach is consumption-oriented food supply chain analysis. I'm going to walk you through this approach in a bit of detail. I actually use this approach as part of my PhD work, so I'm pretty familiar with it. The goal of this is to understand the incentives and disincentives influencing participants' behavior and how the incentives and disincentives could be leveraged to better align the supply chain with healthier diets. And again, you can use a variety of methods to do this. And then lastly, political economy analysis, which examines the roles of power, incentives, institutions, and ideas that shape nutrition policies in reality. And again, I'll talk a little bit about this. And this is also where you see more of the data collection that you might do related to the drivers of the food system if we're going back to the HLP framework. So I'll start by orienting you a little bit to food supply chains and how you might go about doing analysis of them. So food supply chains include the actors and processes that bring a product from its conception to end use by consumers. And so you have the different steps of the supply chain. So input supply, primary production, handling, storage, and transport, processing, and this can be primary and secondary processing. Usually those are in different steps depending on the product that you're mapping. Then you have wholesale and distribution, markets and retail, and consumption. And I think it's important to note that the supply chain can look different depending on the product, and people map the supply chain slightly different. So, for example, a lot of times you might have right after production, you might have post-harvest as one separate step. And that can be important in your analysis, depending on what you're doing the analysis for, which product. When we talk about value chain analysis, so the supply chain analysis is mapping the different steps and then identifying levers throughout the supply chain. And value chain analysis is along the same lines, but you're really focused on the value addition. And that value addition can be a multitude of things. So it could be that you're creating economic value along the supply chain, which is what it historically was developed to do. So that is the business approach that it began with. You could also be adding nutritional value. That's the way that it's often used in the nutrition community, unsurprisingly. And then more recently, another way to look at the value addition is to think about sustainability value addition across the supply chain. And from my perspective, I think it's actually important to be looking at all of them, because when you're thinking about how you might intervene, you don't want to be trying to propose an intervention or a solution that is decreasing the economic value, particularly for farmers. Let's say we're talking about farmers. Maybe it's okay if you're thinking about like food manufacturers for like ultra processed foods. Maybe it's okay if they decrease their profits. But in terms of, say, smallholder farmers, we don't want that to happen. So I think it's really important to think about when you're looking at the value addition across the supply chain, that you're not just looking at the nutritional value, but also looking at other things like the productivity of the crop, as an example, the sustainability of the crop as well. Any questions, comments before I continue? All right.
Nothing in the chat as of now, Shauna.
Okay, thanks. So who are the actors in food supply chains? You can write it in the chat, or you can just unmute yourself. Who are the people that come to mind when you think about the different actors within a food supply chain? I already mentioned subsistence farmers as an example, and food manufacturers. Who else might be actors? Retailers, consumers, yep. Government, marketing federations, marketing companies as well, or advertising companies. Warehouses, so wholesalers maybe. Consumer associations, yep. Good, yep. That you're on the right track. Those are definitely actors in the food supply chain. I see quality control associations as well. And the Food Safety and Standards Authority. Great. So like I said, the different supply chains have different steps. So don't be worried when you see that there's different steps in all these different figures of supply chains that I'm showing. You can essentially create the steps that you need for the product or crop that you're looking at. And they're essentially the same, just sometimes broken out in different ways. So in terms of actors, one of the actors or groups of actors that I didn't see are input companies. So companies that are producing seeds or fertilizer, crop insurance. So one of the, in the chat, one of the actor groups was government. So in the US, for example, a lot of people talk about how we've subsidized corn and soy. And this is not seen as a good thing, obviously, because it's brought down the price of corn and soy, and then they're used as filler ingredients in ultra processed foods. And people, I think, often think that the government is just giving these farmers money to grow this crop. But really, the way that subsidies are working in the US now are really through crop insurance. So it's the incentive for companies to grow these different crops, corn and soy in particular, is that if there's, for example, a climate event and say there's a drought and they don't produce as much corn as they anticipated, they are insured by the government to make sure that they still end up making money, even if they don't produce as much corn as they would have produced. So even though the income coming directly from the production of the corn is going to be decreased, they will be able to make up their income based on this crop insurance. So that can be a really important incentive for farmers to grow specific crops, because for crops like horticulture products, that doesn't exist. They don't have crop insurance in the US, at least. So it creates a disincentives for growing those crops. Sorry, I have like a tickle in my throat, so I'm hoping that it will settle, but I'm gonna just probably have to keep taking sips of water throughout. Um, Other actors are farmers, it could be ranchers, whatever type of farm it is, traders, food companies, retailers, which were mentioned, and you have modern retailers and then more traditional retailers, and then consumers, obviously. And one of the things that came across in the chat was there were a few of you that were mentioning associations. So like you have, for example, different consumer organizations that might advocate on consumers' behalf for example, things like food safety. Because when we're thinking about value addition in terms of nutrition value, it can also be related to things like food safety, obviously. And that's actually an important reason for doing value chain analysis or supply chain analysis, is if there are concerns related to food safety, the supply chain analysis can help to identify how you might intervene to address those issues. So one thing I think it's important to note when we're thinking about value chain analysis or supply chain analysis is that it's very different depending on what types of supply chains you're looking at. So historically, particularly in the agriculture and nutrition space, supply chain analysis has been used for short supply chains, in particular, things like complementary foods or traditional or indigenous local crops. And those are when you're trying to get, usually you're working with subsistence farmers and then trying to look at the steps in terms of like what happens in terms of post-harvest, storage, getting to market, and then at the consumer level, how to create demand maybe for these different crops. But that's a very short supply chain. So it's a lot easier to map. It still can be difficult to look at all the different steps and follow the path of the different crops or foods, but it's much more straightforward than, say, ultra processed foods. So ultra processed foods are really difficult to examine because there's very long supply chains and they're very complex. So if I go back to this slide, when we think about different input companies, when we're thinking about ultra processed foods, like something that might not come to mind are food ingredients. So things like there's different preservatives or stabilizers and that type of thing that can be used in and are used in ultra processed foods to increase shelf life and other things, improve mouthfeel, that type of thing. And those are hard to trace in a supply chain analysis. So it makes it quite difficult. And that's why you see most of the value chain analysis or supply chain analysis that is being done is on the shorter supply chains. So why examine the value chains from a nutrition perspective? I think it can be helpful in terms of identifying bottlenecks or areas where there's policy incoherence in supply and value chains. And what I mean by supply chain, I see in the chat, genetic modifications will come under input. Yes, so if it's, say you have a seed that's been modified, that would be under the inputs. So when I say policy incoherence, I mean when you look at the supply chain and policies upstream are disconnected with, say, policies throughout the rest of the supply chain. So an example of this, just to, I'll continue to use a US example, which I apologize for. And I don't even actually really work in the US. I very rarely work in the US, but I think this is a easy one to articulate the policy incoherence is that if you think of the subsidies that there are already in the agriculture, I'm just going to try and mute whoever. Okay. If you look at the subsidies in our agricultural system in the US, so I mentioned that there's crop insurance now for corn and soy, and in the past there was a lot of government dollars that were going into R&D, which made it over time a very productive crop. So the yields that farmers in the US get for corn and soy are very high. So you have farm policy upstream in the supply chain that's saying, promoting the growing of these different crops. Then on the kind of bottom end of the supply chain, you have dietary guidelines in the US that are recommending that people eat whole foods, that eat lots of fruits and vegetables. But then when we look at our agricultural policy in the US, you know, fruits and vegetables are considered specialty crops. That's what they're called in the Farm Bill, which is the big agricultural policy in the US. And so there's this huge disconnect where you have, on one hand, government telling people to eat in this specific way, and then all of their agriculture policy is pretty much aligned to a totally different vision. That's an example of policy incoherence. And we actually see that a lot in the food system because there's so much vested interest. There's so much power of the lobby groups, depending on the country, obviously. But it means that there's often this pretty big disconnect in terms of policies, and you see a lot of policy incoherence. By mapping the supply chain, though, you can identify where those areas of policy incoherence are and what the incentives and disincentives are, and then you can try and identify what the levers are. So what are the leverage points for interventions that can add value, whether that be economic, nutritional, or environmental, food safety. And that's kind of the idea of the value chain analysis. After you do that, there are additional steps in terms of thinking about those solutions that you've identified to address the bottlenecks in the supply chain and to assess their feasibility. And I'll talk a little bit about that too towards the end of the lecture. So this is from some of the work that Gain has done on value chains and supply chain analysis, and it's just looking at ways to maximize benefits and minimize risks in nutritious food supply chains. So in terms of maximizing benefits, so this is what you're trying to do when you're mapping it out. So you're mapping out the supply chain, and I'll go through how you actually go about doing that. And then you're trying to see where can I, and if you're thinking about accessibility, increase the availability or increase the affordability of this nutritious food. On the flip side, if it's something that you don't want people to be eating because it's unhealthy and you're trying to create disincentives for consumption, then you're thinking about how to decrease the availability or decrease the affordability. In terms of desirability, you're looking at how you can improve advertising to promote consumption of that food, raise consumer awareness and create more demand for it, and produce more appealing products. From a quality perspective, you're trying to improve nutrient content and availability, improve product characteristics, and implement processes and controls. And that was one of the, I think in the chat, there was quality control associations was written in the chat as one of the groups of actors that you might have in supply chains. At the same time that you're trying to maximize benefits, you're also trying to minimize risks. And that can look like reducing post-harvest losses. This is actually really, really huge in LMICs. When we think about food waste and food loss, obviously in LMICs, most of the food that is being lost or wasted is really being lost more upstream in the supply chain, whereas in places like the US, it's food waste where it's being wasted at the consumer retail level. So you can identify what are some of the reasons why you're seeing these losses. And I mean, a lot of times it's related to storage. I've definitely been in places where I'm working with smallholder farmers and there's just not great storage at all. So they're really not able to have any protection from the elements for their crops after they've harvested it. I'll never forget once I was in Senegal and I was working with some subsistence farmers there, and the whole community had grown onions. They had part of the project that I was working on was a drip irrigation project alongside nutrition education. And the farmers were given access to the drip irrigation, but then they were able to choose whatever crops they wanted to produce. And they all decided to produce onions. But then there were so many onions. And so then they didn't want to sell them in the market because the price obviously decreased. It's just, basic economics. And so then they were keeping them, but they didn't have anywhere to store them. So they were just on a tarp, just like it was like a mountain of onions that were just sitting out there with nothing covering them. And so obviously that starts to lead to losses. So in that case, if you're doing a food supply chain analysis, you might identify the lack of storage and then come up with some sort of solution to address that, such as low-cost storage as an example. In terms of desirability and minimizing risks, you might want to, again, improve advertising and reduce adverse product associations. From a quality perspective, reduce food safety risks, reduce product characteristics that push food towards the unhealthy end of the nutrition spectrum. And then in terms of cross-cutting issues that you would be trying to consider, things like stable employment opportunities, ensuring that people have a living wage, environmental sustainability, and gender equity and sensitivity. So this is kind of what it looks like to think about the different steps of the supply chain, kind of building on the previous slide where it's looking at how you maximize benefits and minimize risks. Now it's taking it to each step of the supply chain and how you can maximize nutrition entering the supply chain and minimize it exiting the supply chain. So this is from work that Jess Fonzo did. This is also trying to incorporate some climate considerations as well. So in terms of input supply, improving the varieties, biofortification, fertilizer, irrigation are all ways to maximize nutrition entering the value chain. And in terms of reducing its exit from the value chain, that can be things like ensuring that there's access to inputs. So things like irrigation as an example, or extension services. In terms of production, you might be producing in different locations or expanding production, diversifying production, There might be, so there's some benefits in terms of CO2 fertilization, in terms of yields of some specific crops. You might focus on female farmers. You might focus on extension in terms of trying to reduce it exiting the value chain. That can be like things like trying to address loss of biodiversity, some of the effects related to climate. In terms of post-harvest storage, maximizing nutrition entering includes things like aflatoxin control or refrigeration. And in terms of how it exits the value chain, that can be through contamination, spoilage. One of the things from a climate perspective is balancing this need for, on one hand, refrigeration to ensure the maximization of nutrition entering the supply chain, and on the other hand, reducing or being cognizant of the climate impacts of increasing refrigeration. So I think one of the things that needs to be considered when we're thinking about solutions along the supply chains are these trade-offs. So I was listening to a podcast just recently, and I can't remember who the quote was from, but it was said, the idea of the quote, and I'm paraphrasing, but it was something along the lines of, there aren't solutions, there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. And I think that runs so true when we're thinking about how to intervene throughout the food system. There's never going to be a solution that doesn't have some trade-off and some potential risk that you have to weigh. And so when we're thinking about solutions, we have to ensure that be intentional about the potential impact on other aspects of the food system we care about. So sustainability as one example of that. So if you are going to increase access to refrigeration, you might want to ensure that refrigeration is powered by green energy. So maybe it's a solar paneled fridge or something along those lines, so that you are not increasing the emissions related to adopting this intervention. In terms of processing, nutrition can be maximized by fermentation, drying, fortification, and product reformulation. So product reformulation might be to reduce the salt, the sugar, and unhealthy fats, like, for example, trans fats. In terms of reducing or minimizing nutrition exiting the value chain, that could look like improper processing of foods, nutrient losses during milling, use of unhealthy ingredients. From a distribution perspective, it can be moving food from areas of surplus to areas of shortage and targeting vulnerable groups. And this is actually an area that is being focused on a lot in high-income countries, and maybe, I'm not sure about in South Asia if this has started, or maybe it's been happening for a while, but one of the things that has started to happen more in the US is to have distribution of food that is surplus from, say, restaurants or grocery stores, or say even, schools or universities or conferences, when they cater for too many people and there's all this extra food at the end of the day. There's different apps and different organizations that have developed a system where they collect that surplus food and then they distribute it to people who are, in some cases, living in shelters or in other areas where they might not be able to access a sufficient amount of food. So they're trying to redistribute the food to those in need. Sorry, I'm just like it feels like I'm slowly losing my voice over the course of this lecture. In terms of marketing and retail, Maximizing nutrition, entering the value chain might look like messaging on the importance of nutrition and potentially on sustainability, the benefits of certain foods. In terms of trying to minimizing it, exiting the value chain, that could be things like having regulations around advertising of unhealthy foods to children, as an example. And then from the consumption and food utilization perspective, um, nutrition entering could be things like home fortification with micronutrient powders or sprinkles, although my sense is that people don't really like those. It could be also training in nutritious food preparation, so providing people with the skills um, to be able to cook different kinds of foods that are nutritious, and it could be at-home food preservation. So those are, I hope, just some examples to get you thinking about how nutrition might be entering and exiting the value chain, and thinking about it also from the context of climate. So this slide is from a paper that Carl Davis led that is looking at entry points for environmental variability across the supply chain. So rather than looking at how nutrition is entering or exiting, what he was doing was looking at how climate enters each of these steps of the supply chain. So for example, in production, you might have algae blooms, coral bleaching, drought, and all of that's going to impact production. And then there's these cascading effects, like reducing agricultural income, leading to crop switching, a reduction in product quality. And then in terms of storage and processing, you can have things like the environmental variability that's entering the supply chain, or things like aflatoxins, pests, wildfires. And then that's going to impact food prices, storage capacity, electricity access, and that's going to have these cascading effects, like, for example, increasing spoilage, decreasing food safety. And the same goes on for the different steps of the supply chain. So I recommend, if you're interested in taking a look at this paper, it goes into detail in terms of how environmental variability is impacting the supply chain and what that means for diets and nutrition based on the existing literature. And one of the things that came up in this paper is that there's really a lot of gaps in terms of our knowledge related to how environmental variability is impacting the food system. So we know there's a lot of evidence related to how it's impacting production, and then food security. And then between those two things, there's not a lot of good data. So it's mostly, we see there's a climate event, an extreme event, for example, and then we see how that impacts yields. And then they might look at food insecurity in that population. But the different steps, so what is happening from production through storage and processing to distribution, retail and markets, in our food environments, that's a huge gap in the literature related to environmental variability or climate variability and nutrition, and how it impacts the food system also along those food supply chains to then lead to these nutrition outcomes. Okay, so thinking about how we do the supply chain analysis, you're going through each of the steps of the supply chain, and you're collecting data for each of those steps. And the data that you might use, like I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, really depends on your approach to the work. There's various different ways that you can do it. Generally, it can be solely qualitative, so you might just be doing interviews with different actors along the supply chain, or it could be a combination of qualitative data and quantitative data. I think that's generally the best approach if it's feasible for the work that you're doing. But these are just some examples of the indicators you might use along these steps of the supply chain to do the value chain analysis, or the food supply chain analysis. So in terms of input, supply, and production, you might look at yields. You might use existing data to look at yields as well. It doesn't mean that you have to collect your own data. And I think that's one thing that's really important to note about doing food supply chain analysis or value chain analysis is that you can use a lot of existing data to help you to identify what's happening at the different steps of the supply chain. Obviously, there's going to be gaps in the data, and you can use qualitative data to complement that and ensure that you're getting a good picture of what's going on at each step of the supply chain. So you have yield, production diversity, access to inputs, so things like fertilizer, irrigation, high quality seeds, the cost of inputs, because this is obviously, as you probably all know, this can be a huge deterrent for adopting different inputs as well as technology. You could collect data or assess existing data on use of inputs, time use. This is also particularly important when we're thinking about women, and then farmer profits and incomes. In terms of post-harvest storage, you can look at post-harvest losses, use of storage facilities, post-harvest losses that can be found in FAO data. So if you're looking at, say, the national level, you can use the FAO data to try and fill that step of the supply chain. Again, obviously, we all know that there are a lot of issues with FAO stat and trade, and so we know that there's gaps in the data, but it's a good starting point. And as long as you're using other data sources to try and complement and to get a bigger and more accurate picture of what's going on, I think it can be useful. In terms of distribution, marketing, and retail, you could look at things like distance and access to markets, transaction costs, import and export flows, the availability and price of foods in the markets. So actually, in this step is how you might be able to use quite a lot of the food environment tools. So Dr. Supana next week will be talking about how to measure food environment, and a lot of the tools that she'll be talking about could be used as part of value chain analysis. So to look at things like the prices of foods, the availability of foods in the markets, the promotions of foods in markets, that kind of thing. Other indicators include like percentage of sales. This can be helpful if you're working in more of a formal retail environment where they keep good records and have electronic records of all the sales. It can be a really great resource if you're able to get that data from the retailer. Percentage spent on advertising also can be good, but also difficult to get. Food miles and food waste as well. And Dr. Supana will talk a little bit about how to measure food waste next class too. And then you, at the consumption and food utilization level, you might look at knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors, dietary intake and diet quality or diversity, the intake of specific nutrients, biomarkers of specific micronutrients, as well as food waste. And again, Dr. Supana is going to talk about some of these methods for doing this that could be used as part of food supply chain analysis. Any questions, comments?
None so far, Shona.
Okay, cool. All right, so this is just an example of how you might kind of intervene based on different scenarios. And then once I go through this, I'll provide you with kind of a step-by-step overview of how you would actually do food supply chain analysis. And I'll talk about it from the consumption-oriented food supply chain analysis approach. But it's very similar for the different approaches that I mentioned. So say you have high demand but inconsistent supply. So as an example here, they have beans and legumes in India, steady increase in demand, not followed by supply side investments. So maybe you find in your value chain analysis or supply chain analysis potential problems related to low production capacity, inefficient aggregation, and other post-harvest processes. So then the idea is through this mapping and identifying the bottlenecks, you'd identify potential solutions or combination of trade-offs. So things like innovation in production techniques, innovation in the formulation of inputs for production, organization of producers to supply higher volumes, like a cooperative as an example. These could be solutions to address that issue. If you have high demand and consistent supply, so say dairy and meat products where demand grows with income and where there is an existing and ample base of suppliers, possible interventions might be improved business and regulatory environment, upgrades in technology, or improved mechanisms for coordination between value chain actors. If you have low demand and inconsistent supply, so say value chains for lesser known fruits and vegetables or biofortified crops. Possible interventions might be building capacities for primary production, having a producer organization, social marketing to stimulate demand, subsidies for consumption, or incentives for risk taking by processors and retailers. And then lastly, if you have low demand and consistent supply, so say value chains for fruits and vegetables in areas where fruit and vegetable consumption is not prioritized, you could have interventions like social marketing to stimulate demand, adjustments in the regulatory framework, subsidies for consumption, support for marketing by retailers, or public purchasing programs. So those are just to give you a sense of how you might intervene based on these different kinds of problems that you would see in terms of the demand for different products as well as their supply. Okay, so now I'm going to just go through a step-by-step approach to doing food supply chain analysis. And I'll kind of combine it with how you would do political economy analysis, because I think one of the things that often happens as part of food supply chain analysis is you do a bit of political economy analysis, especially if you're doing interviews with stakeholders or actors across the steps of the value chain. So there are two main steps that you take in terms of doing this value chain analysis. The first is to identify what are the pressure points in the food supply chain where policy interventions could reduce or increase the consumption of whatever food group you're focused on by mediating its availability, affordability, and acceptability. You could also just switch it in for those 4 A's that are included in the Hawks framework that's guiding this class and next, where it's available, affordable, appealing, and aspirational. So you could just replace these by that. So examples are reducing consumption of sugar sweetened beverages or increasing consumption of leafy greens. And then the second step is to identify whether or not the policy interventions are feasible. And this is where the political economy analysis and different stakeholder analysis and approaches to getting input from stakeholders is really relevant. So this is an overview of consumption-oriented food supply chain analysis. And I'll walk you through the different steps of this approach, but it's just one of the several ways of doing supply chain analysis. But like I said before, they all are very similar and have just like slight tweaks between them. So the first thing you do is you would describe the different steps in the supply chain. So from farm to fork. And here you have in this orange color, these are the steps. So inputs into production, food production, primary food storage and processing, secondary food processing, food distribution, trade and transport, food retailing and catering, and then food promotion and labeling. And like I said, the different steps in the supply chain are often slightly different, but you would just do it based on whatever product you are actually analyzing. So the steps are going to look different based on what product you're doing the analysis for, because you're not coming up with those steps a priori. You're letting the value chain analysis show you what the next steps are. So you describe the steps in the chain from farm to fork. Then in the context of consumption-oriented food supply chain analysis, you then describe the organizational, financial, technological, and policy characteristics at each of those steps of the supply chain. Then you describe the incentives and disincentives for each of those. So say there's a technology characteristic like needs to be, let's think about palm oil as an example. It needs to be processed within 24 hours of picking it. So then in terms of incentives or disincentives, what are the incentives or disincentives for that? So for example, it could be then in the context of palm oil and it needing to be processed, at least primary process within 24 hours, then it might be that an incentive is that they have a processor right next to the plantation so that they can do that first step of processing right away. Then you analyze how these characteristics, incentives and disincentives affect the food environment and how they could be realigned. So you want to see what does it mean? So having this, say, using that same example of palm oil, having the incentive of having a processor that's right there means that there will be less lost, right? Because they're able to process right away, so they're not going to lose as much of the palm oil. And then that means that the supply would likely be higher, which means that the price would also likely be lower. And so those are the kinds of things that you think through as you're doing the supply chain analysis. Now, the next two steps are more of a political economy analysis or stakeholder assessment. And I'll talk a little bit about these. The first is to use problem and solution trees to identify the potential policy options or solutions. And then the second component to that is to assess the feasibility of those policy options. And this can take on various forms. Also in terms of the group-based modeling that you'll be learning about and I think applying as part of your class on December 24th. That's also kind of doing the same type of approach, just using different methods, but looking at the problems and identifying potential solutions. And then often in group-based modeling, you might be doing it with stakeholders, and then they might be rating the different options at the end so that you can have a list of, say, prioritized policy actions. So you do, within each of the steps, then you're always coming back to this food affordability, availability, and acceptability, and how that influences diets and nutrition. So it's different than, say, when USAID first started doing a lot of agricultural development work. They used value chain analysis quite a lot, but it was always really focused on farmers' profits, which is great. But they didn't really take into consideration the nutritional content of the crop and like how these different solutions along the value chain to improve, say, yields of a different crop might then influence diets later on and nutrition outcomes later on. And so the difference with using doing food supply chain analysis for nutrition or using, say, consumption-oriented food supply chain analysis is you're thinking about it always from the perspective of nutrition and diets and how the different incentives and disincentives throughout the supply chain are impacting them and through which pathways. So I mentioned this a little bit, but in terms of data sources, there's various different data sources that you can use to do your food supply chain analysis. You could use archival records, so things like FAO data, there's FAO Stat, FAO Trade. Euromonitor data is really good for more of the formal retail sector, and it's also available on the food systems dashboard. So it used to be the case. I remember when I was a PhD student, it was very hard to access the Euromonitor data because it was expensive. So universities didn't want to pay for it. But now that's all available through the food systems dashboard. So I think your assignment is using the food systems dashboard. So hopefully you're orienting yourself towards those data and identifying ways you might be able to use those data to inform some of the nutrition problems in the countries that you're focused on, but also identifying how different drivers of the food system, factors within supply chains, within the food environment are potentially influencing those nutrition outcomes. You can do document analysis. So that's looking at existing documents when you analyze it. So it's kind of similar to if you were coding, say, interviews, qualitative interviews, except for it's not interviews, it's just policy documents and that type of thing. Semi-structured interviews are also often used as part of food supply chain analysis. The idea is that you are trying to get perspectives from different stakeholders. So you wouldn't just focus on, say, farmers, you would have, say, farmers, traders, people from extension, depending obviously on what kind of product or crop you're looking at. But it's important to have perspectives from various stakeholders to fill in the gap. So the idea is that through all these pieces of data, you're starting to get a good picture of what's going on in the supply chain. And then in terms of quantitative data, like I shared some indicators earlier, you can use on-farm data, you can use food environment data, consumption data, and nutrition outcome data too. So it really depends though on what crop and what product you're focusing on. And importantly, which data is available. Because while we want to have the highest quality data, the reality is that we're often constrained by the data that currently exists. So that's something to consider as well. So this is what it looks like to start doing some basic mapping of the supply chain. So you have the step, so in this case, agricultural production. In this case, it was looking at oils. And so you have production of oil seeds, and then you think about what are the organizational characteristics, technological characteristics, financial policy that are impacting the availability, the price, and the marketing of those oil seeds. So it could be that, say, from a technological characteristic perspective, there's low quality seeds. So what does the lowest quality seeds lead to? It leads to a reduction in the availability of the oils, probably an increase on the price, and maybe it's uncertain in terms of how it impacts marketing. So the idea is you start to map out, and you don't have to use like a mental modeler kind of software like this if you don't want to. You could also just do this in a table, but for me, I think it's easier for me to map out and see how all the pieces are fitting together. This is just an example of one step of the supply chain once you start to work this out. So this is the secondary processing. This isn't meant for you to be able to see it, obviously. But you have then, say this is I can't even read it, manufacturing oils, and then you have the different characteristics, like organizational characteristics, technological, etc. And then you work through on how they impact, how these different pathways might influence the availability, the price, and the marketing. But don't let this scare you. You don't have to do it to this same degree of detail. So I've done, this was from my PhD work, which was obviously when you're doing a PhD, you're spending so much time working on this very kind of esoteric question and problem in many ways. And you can do value chain analysis or food supply chain analysis that is relatively quick and not so resource intensive. So it just depends. This is also looking at very long supply chains. And as I mentioned earlier in the class, when you're doing food supply chain analysis of long supply chains, it gets very, very complicated because there's so many different things that are happening. So it really, in my view, using food supply chain analysis, whether it be consumption oriented food supply chain analysis, value chain analysis, the SCAN from Gain, it really works best for shorter supply chains and makes it much more feasible as well. So this is an example of a shorter supply chain and one that is a bit more palatable, I think, than to look at. So this was looking at this example is of the millet, but we looked at a leafy green and then also finger millet in India. And so you have the steps of the value chain here in the purple. And then on the left-hand side, these are just the barriers that like, so the bottlenecks in the supply chain. And then on the right-hand side, you have the facilitators. So this is just kind of summarizing after everything was mapped. So after the supply chain steps were mapped, and we looked at what are the bottlenecks, what are the things that are incentives for this crop, what are the disincentives, that's from that information, we pulled together this figure. And the way that we got the information to include in the figure is by doing interviews with different stakeholders. And through all those pieces of information from what people told us, we were able to identify what the barriers and facilitators were to this crop. So in terms of production, for example, one of the barriers was lack of accessible research to the community. So they're not getting access to, say, the best advice in terms of techniques and that type of thing. And then facilitators were that it's easy to grow, it's drought tolerant and pest resistant. It can supplement rice production. From a processing perspective, barriers included the laborious process. So if you're thinking about time use, but also energy expenditure, also dependent on weather. From a storage perspective, there's post-harvest losses. But a facilitator is that it can be stored for a long time. From a retail perspective, some barriers were difficulties accessing market. There were fluctuations in rates. Production time is long and meeting demand, so there's lack of sufficient supply. But then some of the facilitators included things like it was profitable, it increased income for households so that they could spend it on other expenses. And from a preparation standpoint, there's some safety concerns, which is a barrier. And then facilitators included cooking is not time consuming, which is important because obviously when you're using lots of cooking fuel, that increases the cost. And then in terms of consumption, that it's a barrier is the seasonality component, and facilitators include the health benefits, the taste is desirable, and that it's an alternative to rice consumption. So hopefully this gives you an idea of like, it doesn't have to be like this crazy like map of the supply chain steps. You can do it in a way that is less intensive, less detailed, but you're still identifying what the barriers or bottlenecks are in the supply chain, and then what you might be able to do to address those. So the next step would be to identify what might be some examples of interventions that could address these barriers or leverage the facilitators. So any ideas that people have in terms of knowing this? So by understanding the barriers and facilitators, how might you intervene to improve consumption of finger millet in this case? While you think about it, I'm going to grab a little bit more water because I'm slowly dying here. Nothing in the chat. No one wants to venture a guess. Okay. Well, we'll talk about in the next, in the remaining slides, how you would actually go about doing this. I'm really sorry about my throat. I've been talking a lot today, I guess. All right, so you've identified the bottlenecks in the supply chain. Now what do you do? So one of the approaches that I like to do, and I've used in other projects, is use problem and solution trees. And this is it is a very practical approach to identifying how you might intervene based on the bottlenecks. So you've already identified the bottlenecks in the supply chain, and now you're going to identify how to address them. So this is kind of how you think about problems and solution trees. So you have the problem, and then you think about what are the causes of the problem and what are the effects of the problem. So that has already been done as part of the food supply chain analysis, right? You already have an idea of what's going on at each steps of the supply chain, what are the problems, where are the bottlenecks, and how this is impacting the availability, the affordability, and the acceptability of that food or that product. So similarly, if you have the problem, then you start to think about how these kind of trees feed out. So what are the pathways that then you could identify a solution to address? So say you have high or low intake of sugar sweetened beverages, then what is the impact? How is cost influence supply and preferences? And then that can help you to identify what the solutions might look like. So I'll use a more tangible example. This is from Fiji and Wendy Snowden's work. And she has the problem is low fruit intake. So then what are the reasons why there's low fruit intake? So going back to this slide, what are the causes of the problem? So the causes of the problem are things like poor availability. What's causing that? There's high perishability. What else? Insufficient local production. Why is there insufficient local production? Because there's a rural urban drift, that there's no policy on urban gardens. Not everyone has land. No subsidies or support for fertilizers. This would all come out through the food supply chain analysis. So you're essentially, through the food supply chain analysis, already mapping out what the problems are and how each step is influencing them. What is the step that this is doing is it's then identifying what could be the solution then. So there's no policy on urban gardens. Well, maybe you create a policy on urban gardens. Not everyone has land. Could you increase land usage, or could you improve land tenure rights? There's no subsidies or support for things like fertilizer. Well, could you change the duty? So this is how you start to think about it. So you have the problem, then you start to identify all these different solutions based on the bottlenecks that you see. And then the next step is to identify whether or not they're feasible. So this is a really critical point of this whole process. And this is this is getting into the political economy analysis component, and also the drivers of the food system. If you don't assess whether the solutions are feasible, then you're missing a really important component of the analysis you're doing, because you could come up with, say, on this slide, to have a duty at 0%, so 0% import tax. Maybe that's not at all feasible. Like, I will say, I don't know how much you all have been following in terms of politics in the US, but um, there is an incoming administration that really loves tariffs. So they are all about tariffs. And so already there's been a proposal to increase tariffs um, on food and other products that are coming from, say, Canada and Mexico into the US. So if I were to propose, we should just have, well, there's high food prices, so let's just reduce the duty to 0%. Let's reduce the tariff. That would not be politically feasible at the moment. So it's important to understand the context, the political context, and to understand more broadly the context of the different players that wield power in the food system, but also the perspectives of those that don't wield as much power to identify whether or not the options would be feasible. Because at the end of the day, you don't want to go through this whole process and then nothing is like it's kind of a joke. Like there's no way that these policies would be adopted. So it is an important part. Like as an example, when I was doing this as part of my PhD, one of the solutions that I came up with based on doing the supply chain analysis was to increase the duty or the tax on imports of palm oil because it was so cheap and so widely available. And so it was an incentive for people to purchase and consume it. So if you were to increase the price of that, then the idea is that people would shift maybe to other oils if they became more affordable. And that was not politically feasible at all because palm oil is just so cheap. And so even if you increase its price, the alternative oils are um, still going to be high, and then making it harder for people to make ends meet in terms of getting the food that they need based on the budgets that they have or the income that they have. So it's just not politically feasible to do that at the time, at least. So that's why it is important to go through this step. So in terms of how you might do it, so I mentioned political economy analysis. Political economy analysis can include things like semi-structured interviews with key stakeholders. It generally does. You might also have deliberative workshops. You could have multi-stakeholder panels. You can do SWOT analysis, which I mentioned is part of the SCAN approach to doing value chain analysis. You could use Delphi surveys with different stakeholders to reach consensus on the prioritization of different policies or solutions. And then you could have multi-criteria decision analysis, which I'll talk a little bit about. I know it says multi-stakeholder, I should say multi-criteria. So this is just I put this in just so that you all can have a good reference if you want to do political economy analysis as part of your own work. This is a protocol paper from some of my former colleagues at the University of Sydney. And it provides a good overview of the approach that you might take to do political economy analysis. So you look at the structural and contextual factors, the bargaining process, who the stakeholders are, incentives and ideas, and then the governance and legal structures, and then what the drivers are. And then you document things like your assumptions throughout the process. But I recommend you taking a look at this paper if this is something you're interested in. The other thing that you might do is use health policy frameworks to guide a policy analysis. So you've come up with, say, your different solutions, and then you want to do a policy analysis to assess them. And there are various different policy frameworks that you might use. I included a few of the key ones I think that are used in global health. So the Walton Gilson policy triangle framework is very, very commonly used. At least it was about 10, 15 years ago now. And it's very easy to use. So basically, you would say you're doing semi-structured interviews. as part of your approach to looking at the feasibility, you're doing semi-structured interviews with key stakeholders. So what do you do with those interviews? You likely record them and then you transcribe them if you have the resources to do that. And then you might use qualitative data analysis to look at their feasibility. And what you might do with a health policy framework is use it to guide your analysis. So say I was coding these qualitative interview transcripts, I would code related to the context. So maybe it's like a contextual reasons why the policy is or isn't feasible, who the actors are, but in the context of that, of the feasibility of that policy approach, the content. So maybe there's something specific to the content that makes it less feasible. And then the process itself. Maybe the process would take, say, 10 years to implement, and there aren't sufficient, there's not a sufficient workforce to be able to assess whether or not people are actually adopting the law and following the regulation, and that type of thing. So this framework, while it's very simple, I found it to be quite useful in a lot of the policy analysis work I've done. But it's just one one of many frameworks. Then you have the multiple streams theory. This is also used quite a lot in terms of policy analysis. One of the key parts here that is important to think about when we're thinking about the feasibility of different policy options is the policy window. So the policy window is that space that you have that you might not normally have to adopt a specific policy or intervention. So maybe I'll I'll use another political example from the US because it's on my mind. But there's the person who has been nominated to lead Health and Human Services. So, like, basically all the health department, or it's like the equivalent of a Ministry of Health in the US, is really not into ultra processed foods. He thinks ultra processed foods are really bad. And so there's a policy window related to, say, taxation or marketing regulation to children related to ultra processed foods, because there's this current policy window of this person who has an interest in it and is in a position of power. So it's important to think about those things, and that's why this framework can be useful as well. You can also combine frameworks, which I've also done in the past, that can be useful. And then there's the advocacy coalition framework. This is also used quite a lot in terms of global food policy analysis. One of the things that sets this framework apart is that there's different coalitions. So you might, and you'd be analyzing those. So a coalition could be like, say, a lobbying group related to sugar sweetened beverages, and then the other coalition might be, say, an organization that is trying to fight diabetes. So when you analyze those different groups of stakeholders, you might find a lot of disconnects or areas where they're not aligned. And then that can be places where you might come up with some sort of novel solution to address some of the discord there. Could also be just highlighting how the argument is being shaped. So, for example, in the sugar sweetened beverage space, obviously the lobbying groups are trying to often really influence how the messaging comes across related to sugary drinks. So, as an example, there is a group here that was trying to block a soda tax, and they framed their argument that it would increase people's grocery bill. And so that was very effective with consumers. So trying to analyze how those different coalitions are operating can be helpful in terms of identifying levers in terms of policy. And then the last framework I'll show you is just the 5 stages of the policy process. Again, I found that to be quite helpful in terms of analyzing the feasibility of different policy options. So you have agenda setting, the policy formulation, decision making, implementation, and evaluation. The other thing I wanted to mention is
Shauna just
Mhm.
wanted to highlight that we have like around 7 more minutes left.
Yep, yep. I just have a couple of slides left. In terms of multi-criteria decision making is when you have the different stakeholders, and then as a group, those stakeholders decide what are the criteria for assessing the feasibility or um, the ranking or prioritization of different policies. And then that group of stakeholders actually scores the policy options based on the criteria that they come up with, and then they can rank them. So an example of this is, again, from one of Wendy Snowden's paper, but the criteria that was used in this case is technical feasibility of the policy, cost feasibility, political, cultural, trade related, and then you weight the criteria. So the stakeholders also decide how they want to weight the criteria. So in this case, the political acceptability, probably unsurprisingly, was the most important. And then for each of these different criteria, they give it a score. And then you have an overall score for each of the policies, and you're able to compare and come up with a ranking and prioritization. So again, I think that using multi-criteria decision-making can be a really helpful tool in terms of assessing and comparing different policy options that have been identified through food supply chain analysis or value chain analysis. And this is just an example of going through not only in this case, you have the different criteria, but you also consider the unintended consequences of the different policies. And that's something that's important to note because as I said, there's not solutions, there's just trade-offs. And so when we're thinking about different policy options throughout supply chains, there's often unintended consequences. So it's important to think those through and try and anticipate them and tweak the policies or solutions to try and reduce any negative impact that they might have. So hopefully, I know that was a lot. I hope that it gave you at least a foray into doing food supply chain analysis and the different approaches that you might take to do that. So as I mentioned, the next class will focus on these other steps of the framework to developing a comprehensive or complementary set of actions to improve diets and nutrition using a food systems approach. So